Right, thanking and praising God for, among other things, the way in which, we hadn't said it recently, the way in which He helps us to find balance. This time, with regard to our fears in this chapter, that seems to devote a significant amount of time to helping us better understand things we should and should not be afraid of or anxious about. As I think this chapter breaks down into thirds, as I often say, at least as I understand it now, with that first section going roughly from, I think, verse 1 through about verse, let's say, 34, talking about a balance between our fears. As we said, things we shouldn't fear and things that we should. As the next section, verses 35 going through about 48, it's going to talk about the need to be ready, specifically as he's addressing it to his apostles and disciples, but likewise in ways that we would be wise to be ready, as well as the last section going from verses 49 to the end of the chapter, verse 56, it seems, is going to talk about some things that we need to understand as his people. But backing it up and slowing down a little bit, let's look at the way that verses 1 through 3 are going to talk about the way in which they need to be very afraid of the tendency to become hypocritical, or they need to fear hypocrisy, as he is going to warn them in the famous warning against the leaven of the Pharisees, which he is literally going to say is hypocrisy. As in verse 4, he's going to shift gears and talk about some things that they do not need to fear. In verses 4 through 7, he's going to say, do not fear people from the perspective of what they can physically do to you, even though there are some very real consequences in the way of crimes that we can commit against one another. He says, it is more wise to not put the fear of people above the fear of God, who can not only destroy body, but he can cast soul into hell. And so even though we are wise to sometimes be apprehensive about the dangers that other people pose to us, we are never to be so intimidated by people that we allow them to overshadow the greater fear and respect that we should have for God. So he's then going to go on to say, not only do we do well to avoid the fear of intimidation by people, we need to overcome the fear of the shame that we can feel when people begin to look down on us, talking about the ways in which we need to avoid being intimidated, overly caring about the things that people think about us. Understanding that, once again, shame is a very real thing, and we should avoid doing shameful things. We should, however, not be so influenced by what people think of us that, once again, we begin to lose track of the way in which we can bend our will to people in a way that makes God ashamed of our character. Going on, though, he is going to talk about the way that we should actually fear something else, which is covetousness in verse 15, talking about a dispute between two brothers who wanted him to be less what God had called him to be, and more a judge in their property dispute. He's going to give them a parable about a man who had everything he needed, but because his character was lacking, it meant nothing to him, because he did not devote his things to the kinds of priorities that God has for us all. Saying in verse 15, and he said to them, take care and be on guard against covetousness, a thing that we should all fear more than people. As likewise, in verses 22 through roughly 34, he's going to give a very famous warning against the anxieties that we can have about our basic needs, like food and shelter. Food, clothing, and shelter. Understanding that those are legitimate concerns, but they are concerns that should be put in perspective. Understanding that, much like he said in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, if we seek first the kingdom of God, God willing, we do not have to worry about these things in the way that we otherwise would if we were simply trying to handle life on our own. Going on, though, he is then going to tell them that they need to be ready in verses 35 through 40, talking about the way that they need to be awake in the same way that servants would be awake for a master that was away at, I think it is a wedding feast. It's going to say in verse 36, be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from, the wedding feast. And so in addition to telling them that they need to be physically awake, he's going to say that they need to be trustworthy, because if they are awake but they are shady and untrustworthy, they're still going to have problems. And so he's going to say their character matters as well as their preparation, diligence to duty, and again, the way we treat people without God having to constantly tell us to treat people with the same respect or care that we would want. As he is in addition going to tell them that there's some other things they need to understand, in particular, his role in relationship to us and the earth. As he's going to say he's not coming to bring peace, but a sword. He is not coming to forcibly reconcile those who are shady or, I guess, otherwise untrustworthy with those who are trustworthy. We don't have to be perfect, but taking the whole of these gospels together, it seems, this is just my estimation, it seems that what he is doing is just like we saw in the parable of the wheat and the tares. He is weeding out those who are committed to being shady from those who are otherwise willing to listen and allow him to transform them into something that is not just trustworthy on this level, but something that's completely trustworthy on another level, something that Jesus described in the Sermon on the Mount as perfection. As he is going to go on in verses 54 through, 56, to say not only do they need to understand why he came to spend time with his people, but they need to understand the urgency of the times in much the same way that they understand how to interpret the times of the skies or the weather or the things that affect, as we mentioned before in the previous Gospels, their ability to make money or simply to live life. In much the same way they can interpret the things that affect their physical well-being or prosperity, they need to be able to interpret the urgency of the time that God has given them to get things right with him. And in the last section, verses 57 through the end of the chapter, verse 59, they're going to say within that urgency to understand the amount of time God has given them to get things right with him, they need to understand the priority they need to place on getting things right with one another, specifically in not losing sight of the role of justice, something that can be hard to persuade people of the importance of now, but it still matters. Understanding that getting our way is temporary, but justice is eternal. And in a chapter that reminds his people of what they should and should not fear, Christ seems to be once again reminding them that we all have an appointment with the God who judges us based on a standard of justice. And if we are using our time here, as the teachers used to say back in school, wisely, then we are emphasizing our need to understand justice as much as we often like to talk about God's mercy, understanding that he is not the God of one or the other. The God of mercy is still the God fundamentally of justice. And as he has warned his apostles in the very beginning of this chapter, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, that leaven being hypocrisy, allowing ourselves to believe that we are getting ready for forever with the God who values justice, while in reality, we become desensitized to why it even matters. Which, in addition to sometimes saying, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, it's why we sometimes also say, God's best to you as you go forward with him, God willing, even more specifically, as we seek to have him genuinely restore our interest in and, even more importantly, our commitment to true justice, even as we continue to thank him for his mercy.